common in the read technique for investigators to ask what the suspect thinks the purpose of the interview is. Individuals who are being honest are more likely to use realistic words to describe the crime, while deceptive individuals may answer vaguely or use soft words like hurt or attack instead of murder. Christopher's use of the word killed here is in line with what a truthful subject might say. However, his reference to the girl in the hospital is vague. This may be an example of how most people who are being deceptive won't answer every question in a deceptive way. People will generally provide a mix of deceptive and truthful behaviors, but there will be more deceptive indicators when someone is lying and more truthful indicators when someone's being honest. This is why it's important for detectives to interpret body language and verbal responses in conjunction with the actual physical evidence. Although Christopher has not been formally diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, it's always interesting when people such as psychopaths use language like this, because it shows their awareness of what empathy, or lack of, is, but also their ability to be manipulative. Christopher's statement here may be what is known as a convincing statement. Individuals who are telling the truth don't usually feel the need to prop up their story with convincing statements about what a great person they are, because they know the facts are on their side. On the other hand, individuals who are being deceptive may use these sorts of statements to bolster their image and persuade detectives to believe them. Christopher's voice is slightly shakier, and he overall sounds less sure of himself here as the detectives attempt to break his confidence. And although Christopher states his relief that Jamie is expected to survive, he's likely panicking at the thought that she may be able to identify him. Although Christopher's response sounds okay at first glance, it's a red flag that he qualified his answer with the word probably. Most truthful individuals would provide a firm response in a situation like this. If the officers had doubt about his involvement before, then they definitely don't any longer. This statement indicates that not only does he know the exact area the police are referring to, but he won't go there again. This may have been a slip-up on his part, as Christopher was likely trying to convince the detectives that not only was he not involved in the crime, but he could have even potentially been the killer's next victim. However, in doing so, he seemingly confirmed that he had been in that area. In addition, asking the suspect to elaborate on their knowledge of the evidence is a common way to get them talking, and a possible opening for them to make mistakes. While driving around on Saturday night, Christopher and Stephen traveled all the way to Mount Vernon. Christopher states that they eventually parked in a driveway down one of the back roads for a bathroom break, but he doesn't clearly remember where they were. Unsurprisingly, the detectives find this to be more than suspicious, but rather than confront Christopher just yet, they switch gears to a new topic: the gang. Stephen had recently formed the Disciples of Destruction, looking to achieve a sense of brotherhood along with financial prosperity. He recruited none other than Christopher, Billy, and Quinn, where the essential values of the group consisted of loyalty and violence, with the only way in being the commission of crime. The recruit would invade a house and dispose of anyone who may be inside. Seeing as Christopher was having trouble at home, he wanted more than anything to be part of something where he could freely express himself. Christopher had been accusing his mother of emotional and physical abuse for quite some time, claiming that she would allegedly pin him to the floor and pop acne on his back, spank him, and require him to carry a vacuum around the house. The accusations were never confirmed, but his mother did recall a time where she had spanked the child so hard with a wooden spoon that the utensil broke. She would later admit that she regretted losing her control, but has since denied any of the other allegations, and there is no evidence of them being true. Nonetheless, during his early teenage years, Christopher began to have dark and twisted fantasies about his mother, and wished that one day he would carry them out. Confessing his evil thoughts to a counselor at cadet camp, he supposedly stated his thoughts of wanting to cut his mother into pieces and listen to her scream like I screamed. The counselor, horrified at what they'd heard, immediately notified Christopher's parents. They were absolutely shocked at the confession and didn't wait long to bring Christopher in for a psychological evaluation. The psychiatrist concluded that he'd been displaying traits of antisocial personality disorder, but was too young to be formally diagnosed. Despite the blood-curdling fantasies, the teenager was not considered a threat to society, or at least that's what was decided at the time. If these dark and twisted fantasies were expressed as just Christopher's angry thoughts towards his allegedly abusive mother, it would be difficult to have him committed to a psychiatric facility. In addition, inpatient psychiatric hospitalizations are typically limited to days or weeks at most. It's rare for patients to be committed for months at a time unless they have a very severe mental illness. So, although Christopher displayed all the signs of likely being a hazard to society, it's difficult for his parents, his counselor, or his psychiatrist to do anything to stop him from someday acting on those thoughts. Sadly, in many cases, it's only when the person acts that measures are taken to prevent them from harming others again. Angry and frustrated, it seems to be of excellent timing when he and Stephen had reconnected in 2009. This is the prisoner's dilemma at play again, this time with Christopher being on the receiving end of it. He likely believes that his selective memory is a safe bet right now, as it leaves the door open for him to suddenly remember something later and adjust his story. However, what he doesn't seem to realize is that having a memory of extremes like this is highly suspicious. With this in mind, the detectives are hoping to back Christopher into a corner, but the teenager refuses to budge. Although this won't last for long, Christopher's question stands out as a possible indication of deception. Someone who's being truthful is more likely to adamantly deny any involvement in a firm tone of voice. But Christopher's is weak, and his question is clearly lacking any actual denial. The detective is also using an alternative explanation that minimizes the suspect's role in the crime by asserting that Christopher has knowledge of it, but without accusing him of taking part in the act itself. During the interrogation, one of the detectives has been stepping out of the room to retrieve information from the other interviews that are taking place with Billy, Quinn, Stephen, and Autumn. And little does Christopher know, his friends weren't as willing to conceal the truth. Investigators again pose the alternate theory that gives the appearance of minimizing the severity of the crime. This is meant in part to keep the suspect talking, and eventually willing to admit to something, and eventually the truth of their role in the crime. Nonetheless, Christopher refuses to waver on his original story, invoking that as an Eagle Scout, murder is not a core value. The detectives have shifted from placing the blame on Stephen to making Christopher the actual ringleader. They've tried playing him as the victim who simply followed along, but since that tactic didn't work, their next option is to evoke anger or guilt in hopes that he will tell the truth. It's possible that the investigators believe that he's the psychopathic mastermind, and that calling him out on it would appeal to his nature. Trying to paint him as a follower if he is the leader would, after all, be an insult to him. Most people would tell a person that was severely injured they were sorry it happened, regardless of their involvement. It's part of an empathetic response. Christopher's answer lends significant credibility to the idea that he is on the psychopathic end of antisocial personality disorder, since lack of empathy is a key component of psychopathy. This statement labels him something of a deviant, whether he was guilty of this particular crime or not. Following the heated confrontation, Christopher decides that he doesn't want to speak with the detectives any longer. But over an hour later, he seems to have changed his mind. Not only this, but now we're able to hear from the much-talked-about Billy, who has been confessing all along. The detectives begin by reading Billy his rights, and quickly dives into his side of the story. The detective informs Billy that he's not the only suspect being interviewed at this very moment. Billy is minimizing his involvement by using the word just. This is likely an attempt to lessen his punishment and possibly any feelings of guilt. Given how quickly he admitted to being there, it's possible that he either felt compelled to clear his guilty conscience, or he's a person who succumbs easily to pressure. In addition, when more than one person is involved in a crime, a psychological phenomenon known as diffusion of responsibility occurs. This means that each person feels less responsible for the crime because the responsibility is shared. If Billy is being honest and saying that he was there but didn't actively participate in the attack, he may have justified the crime to himself because others were doing something much worse. Eventually, Quinn agreed to go along and even brought an extra pair of gloves per Stephen's request. If Billy isn't a violent criminal, it makes sense that he's tried to block that night from his memory. It can be traumatic to witness such a scene, and oftentimes those who come along for the ride, like Billy claims to have done, could be somewhat afraid of speaking out or trying to stop the others from committing the crime. In addition, Billy may think that if he keeps the details to a minimum, it will make him seem less culpable and save him from having to answer uncomfortable questions. But what Billy may have known was that Stephen, the supposed ringleader of the group, had apparently been discussing his urge to commit a brutal crime. Next, Billy explains that Christopher had driven the group of four to the address of 4 Trow Road. They originally planned to burglarize the house next to the Cates, but abandoned the idea out of fear that it would be too big and confusing. Christopher dropped his accomplices off at the residence, but quickly drove off to find an appropriate parking spot, deciding on a house's long driveway down the road. Around 30 minutes later, he met the three back at the Cates' home to plan their entry. There is a noticeable delay before Billy answers this question. When someone hesitates before responding, this usually indicates they're thinking about what to say. Since this was a simple question and he should have readily known if he went inside or not, the pause was likely due to him considering what would happen if he said no. He may have pondered if he would get in less trouble. However, Billy rejected this idea as he may have realized that the detectives already knew he was inside, so lying might make things worse for him. Next, we pick up with Christopher, whose confession is one of the most chilling that you'll ever hear. Sociopathy is not an actual clinical diagnosis, but rather a term that describes a set of personality factors. The terms sociopath and psychopath are sometimes used interchangeably and have many similarities, but there are a few key differences. Sociopaths may form some attachments to a select few people, while psychopaths are unable to have a genuine connection with anyone. Psychopaths are more likely to be calculating and appear charismatic, whereas sociopaths are more reckless and disorganized. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder may fit the description for sociopathy or psychopathy, but the official diagnosis would be antisocial personality disorder. Christopher's traits seem to heavily align with this disorder, which may not come as a surprise to everyone. Only days before October 4th, 2009, Christopher had sent a frightening message to his ex-girlfriend, Ashley Martin. "I've tried letting my nice side run things. It didn't work. Now the dark side of me will." Many people with antisocial personality disorder will describe having these two sides to their personality. They can be very charismatic and personable in many cases. However, it doesn't take much for the other side to emerge, which is often triggered by anger, stress, or if the person simply has a need to fulfill. This strongly suggests that although Christopher did not know the victims, there was a conditional intent to kill if people were present in the house. However, premeditation doesn't require a certain period of time to form as an element of murder. Only enough time to form the intent, consider the crime, and then act. This can be as little as a few seconds. But this may not have been the only crime committed by Christopher and Stephen. Apparently on Sunday, September 27th, only 1 week prior to Kimberly's death, a robbery had taken place in Brookline right next to Stephen's house. The McNeil family had left for church at the same time they did every Sunday and returned later that afternoon. It wouldn't be until around 7:30 p.m. that they noticed their back door to the porch had been kicked in. Along with this, they discovered that various items of jewelry were missing, in addition to an iPod, a piggy bank, and several other valuables. Supposedly, Christopher had known the family quite well as they attended the same church, and Stephen was also well acquainted with them on account of the family's close living quarters. Although it hasn't been confirmed, it is most likely the previous robbery that Christopher is referring to here. This information clearly shows preparation for the commission of the crime of murder and goes to support premeditation. Christopher also has an interesting deviation from the story here, as the knife he had seems to hold just as much interest to him as the upcoming story. Take note of Christopher's wording here. He asserts his superiority over Billy, who most likely had an emotional response and panicked, whereas Christopher believes himself to be someone that would never get locked in a room. Continuing with the course of events, once Stephen was inside of the home, he quietly made his way to the back door, where Christopher and Quinn were waiting outside. They eventually found Billy in the basement and proceeded with their depraved plan. Upon their entry, they noticed that the residence had motion detectors. In hopes to avert the system, Christopher swiftly located the breakers next to the front door, cutting the power within a second. As they began to search for jewelry, an iPod was discovered in one of the several rooms, most likely Jamie's. Using the iPod screen light to guide their way, Stephen led the sadistic pack towards the master bedroom, where Kimberly and her daughter were peacefully sleeping. According to Christopher's description of Stephen's behavior, it seems that Stephen was experiencing a rage blackout, which is similar to those that people with anger management issues struggle with. The person often acts very primitively, as was the case with Stephen and how he brutally murdered Kimberly. Christopher's actions are calmer and more methodical. Evidence of this can go to show many things, among them a sense of self-control and understanding, which negates any sort of non-culpability defense. A court-appointed psychiatrist would be able to interview Christopher and easily determine that he understood the nature of his acts and knew at the time of the crime that they were wrong. However, he may have wanted to portray himself as remaining in control because he believed it made him look stronger compared to Stephen. For someone with antisocial personality disorder, they might see it as very negative to lose control, as they often view themselves as superior to others. Whether he lost it or not, the outcome of their twisted idea of fun was something beyond your worst nightmare. Horrifically so, Kimberly had been struck with a machete in the head and torso 36 times, while her daughter had suffered 18 severe wounds, including a punctured lung, a fractured elbow, a cracked skull, and a partially amputated foot. Following the murder, Quinn had unexpectedly turned the lights back on, forcing them to look at the disturbing scene. However, this may have given them even more of the gratification that they so greatly desired. And although the perpetrators were convinced that their work had been done, they underestimated just how strong that 11-year-old girl really was. Petrified, Jamie lay there on the blood-stained floor while her attackers stole a few pieces of jewelry before fleeing the scene. Pretending that she had succumbed to her injuries, Jamie was able to escape the cruel fate that they had so mercilessly tried to bring upon her. She was able to gather all of her strength and dial 911. When someone encounters a threat, they may stop all movement and sound in an attempt to hide from whatever the threat is, also known as the freeze response. The idea is that by drawing as little attention to themselves as possible, they may minimize the danger. In doing so, there's no doubt that Jamie showed an incredible amount of courage, and although it seems we've heard every blood-curdling detail from Christopher, Billy is suddenly rather hesitant to give the full story. Billy's answers have been brief, and while not completely avoidant, they have been limited. This could be taken in one of two ways. Either he's guilty and trying to hide his crimes, even feeling remorse or disgusted about what they took part in, or he's a traumatized onlooker who had no idea what was going to happen, and whose brain blocked out much of the memory as a protective measure. We know that our brain is capable of protecting itself from traumatizing events in this way, but this is also an awfully convenient excuse that someone can use when trying to avoid openly and honestly retelling the events that occurred. In In spite of this, the detective informs Billy that forensic evidence will always prove fact from fiction, so it's in his best interest to be completely transparent. He finally admits to stepping foot in the master bedroom for a short amount of time.
For today, we will like to stop here. Watch out for the next episodes of the remaining crime story.